premise of the book is that it takes place in a world, if you don't pay your hospital bills, you don't get to leave. And so the book is told from the point of view of these people who bust people out of these prison hospitals, these dysfunctional vigilantes. And I got the idea reading the LA Times, and there was an article about a maternity hospital in Nigeria where people were holding women hostage and not letting them leave until all the payments had been received. And it seemed especially cruel because they were separating women from their newborn babies in that really essential bonding time. So there was like this real urgency to, connect the mother and the child. And I was horrified by it. And I was like, man, something like that could never happen here. And then I started to think about it, and I was like, well, actually, it probably something like that could happen. I started to imagine the conditions where it could, because I mean, we live in a capitalist society that in one sense it doesn't make sense to lock up patients so they can't work, but holding them hostage and under certain conditions does make a lot of sense. And I think a lot of people, all it takes is to go through a car accident to feel like you're a prisoner, to feel like you're being held hostage by the healthcare system and being utterly bankrupt by just chance. You can do everything right, you can have the right insurance, and you can still end up in this situation. So a lot of people, as I've gone on the road, have, as they hear about the premise, are like, yeah, this is like, 5 minutes into the future, not some indeterminate thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's creepy in that way. And I have to say, like, if you have any experience being in the hospital or being with somebody who is in the hospital, it's obviously an unpleasant place to have to stay, unless maybe you're there for the birth of a child. But even then, and what I find interesting and a little bit darkly funny is the ways in which the hospital experience sort of mirrors, in some ways, incarceration. Like, you get ID'd, you get a wristband. You have to change into their clothes. Basically, you're in some sort of like hospital garb, and then you want to leave, but you can't leave. They monitor your movements. They're monitoring all your vitals. And then finally, when it is time to go, you get like a plastic bin with all your belongings in it. And they sort of walk you to the door. It's like being like sprung from prison in a way.
Yeah, and Brad, that I served in the Navy, and so that whenever I run into something that's overly institutionalized, I get that kind of vibe. And since I was kind of a bad sailor, there were many circumstances where my liberty was restricted in the parlance of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So I think your analogy is dead on.
So what do you mean you were a bad sailor?
Well, I was a good worker on the ship, but I would get a little carried away when I was on the beach. So that was um, I found out. Let's say I found out pretty early on, thanks to the Navy, that I might have a substance abuse problem because I kept running afoul with the regs.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to talk about the cast of characters that you've created, and I'm wondering like what you were grabbing from. I think when writers are building characters, they're always or usually, uh, you know, uh, building them from various people in their lives, their amalgamations. Some of
Hmm.
it's imagination, but this is a very vivid cast of characters, and I just want to hear you talk a little bit about how you cast your novel and assembled this crew of vigilantes who go and spring people from these rehab facilities.
Sure thing. Well, like one of the early inspirations was kind of those large ensemble TV shows, like where they have there's a group and they have a headquarters and they're all in the room together and they finish each other's sentences. And it's cheesy and corny. And after 3 episodes, you're like, I think I might be in love with this character and I hate that character. And that was part of the inspiration because I love those shows too. But also just, going through recovery, um, you just meet some really interesting people. and especially in the rooms and in rehab scenarios. I never did an inpatient rehab; it was all outpatient. Um, but like you'll get these bits of wisdom and caring and real warmth, and you just hear things that you absolutely need to hear, and are just um, like the miracle of recovery will happen for you from a guy that's like got no teeth, or has been incarcerated for most of his life, or who may not even have a place to stay at that particular moment. Like you pull back and you like and you see like, wow, like the rest of the world would probably cross the street if they saw them coming, but here they are, the whole magic of broken people helping broken people. So I really wanted to kind of get that into the novel as well.
Yeah, that's the thing about addiction is that it's not exclusive to a particular class or race or anything. Like it transcends all of that. So, I mean, I've not been through recovery myself, but I have been to meetings before as an observer, and it's pretty extraordinary and extraordinarily moving and a little bit harrowing too sometimes.
It can be all those things in a single meeting.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think too that setting the book in Los Angeles, I mean, obviously you have experience here in town and are a Californian, but it is, and I don't know if you have the statistics on this, but it has to be one of the places in the world with the highest per capita number of rehabilitation centers. I want to say there was an article in the New Yorker years ago that was particularly interested in Malibu.
Yeah.
And the calculation was that there were like, I want to say some crazy number of rehab facilities in Malibu. It was like 2,000. So there was like one rehab center for every 14 people, or you know what I'm saying? You do the math and it was something crazy like that. So is
Yeah.
that correct? I mean, in your,
Well, I know Malibu, I don't know the numbers. I know that there are quite a few. And over the years of interacting, I know that, there's this illusion of Malibu being this place that's, completely gated off and walled off in the rest of reality. Um, but there are quite a few rehab centers, sober living homes. I mean, I think if you count sober living facilities, then that definitely there's a bunch up there. And we also know that like, rehab works, when the person is ready for it. And lots of times, because of, you know, nowadays you get a DUI, you're going to AA meetings, whether you want to or not. And maybe that's conducive, but maybe not. But like, you know, if you have a problem and everyone in your family says, hey Jim, go talk to Brad because we think he could really use this, if you're not ready to hear it, it's just not going to work. So you get up to a place like Malibu where you have all these rehabbies funneling through, maybe not the safest place or most desirable place, just
well,
from that turnover.
it's also big business. I mean, these places are not cheap, or some of these places anyway, and people make money running these facilities. And I'm not knocking anybody for making a living. It's vital work, but it is big business, right? And there has to be some aspect of it that might be opportunistic, though
Oh
I'm
God.
only
Oh
speculating.
yeah, they prey on people. Like when I was first, when I was a newbie first going to meetings, people would just kind of descend on me and be like, wanted to know my living situation. Do I need a sponsor? But a lot of these people also ran sober living homes, and they wanted to fill their beds. Um, they had a little van. They go pick people up, and they just try to get you into their facility for your own good.
What about medical insurance? I know medical insurance does cover some rehabilitation cost if you have a decent policy, but in terms of like sober living homes and transitional housing for somebody who's coming out of an inpatient stay for rehab, does that like who absorbs the cost for that usually?
I think usually families absorb it. I think that's mainly the case, and that's why you get this, fatigue, and you have this population of people who are kind of on the outs with the rest of society because they've exhausted all their resources. They don't have a family to go to anymore because they tried, or they half-heartedly tried, or they went to a facility because, someone urged them to go, or because they had gotten arrested again, or something like that. Um,
Hmm.
so that's kind of the reason why, aside from my own recovery, why I chose this demographic, to write about, because, in the book, I call it conditional release, where you sign a paper where your release is conditional on paying everything. And in Make It Stop, they call it stay until you pay. And the whole idea of, like, if let's say the state of California or any state's going to start rolling this out, well, they're not going to start like on a cancer ward or something like that. They're going to start with the most vulnerable people imaginable. They're going to start with people who have brain health issues, people who are in a mental health crisis, people who are, substance abusers and addicts and alcoholics and people on the streets. Those are the people who are going to get swept up in these policies without really understanding what's going on.
And they essentially get, if they can't pay, then they essentially end up in a gulag.
That's right. What's interesting is that you mentioned Fight Club at the top of the show, and I was really excited to hear that because um, fairly late in the revising process of this book, I just happened to watch Fight Club again, and everybody remembers the whole line about Fight Club, right? About we don't talk about Fight Club, and they remember Brad Pitt and his beautiful half naked body, but I was just fascinated by Project Mayhem, because here's this vigilante group that was like had totally different purpose than Make It Stop, but it was really exciting to see what they did and what they were doing and how they recruited people and all that stuff. And I have a theory that if 9/11 hadn't happened so close on the heels of the release of Fight Club, where suddenly the idea of discussing blowing buildings up became not something you wanted to do in public or on public transportation, and certainly not on airplanes, um, that maybe some Project Mayhem like organizations, some vigilante groups may have gotten off the ground to stop this like completely corporate course of living that we seem to be on.
Well, yeah, no, I think of like Occupy Wall Street, and I'm trying to place that in time. I don't know what year that was, but you could see maybe something like that being an outgrowth of that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, 9/11 changed everything.
Yeah,
And
because now when they don't won't know what to do with you and they want to, like, put you away and not have to explain why, they slap domestic terrorism charges on you, right?
right, right. So the vigilante group that you've assembled is badass, also a little funny, a little bit fucked up. These people are committed to fighting back against what's it called? Health Net Secure. It's
Mm-hmm.
like this giant consortium of healthcare facilities that is essentially, like we've been talking about, holding people hostage. And you've got your vigilante group. The protagonist, Melanie, is this like punk rock chick. The organization that's a fair characterization. I don't mean to minimize her, but that's just how I think of her. She had the mohawk in the beginning and she's tatted up, and she's
Yep.
kind of a badass. And the organization that goes out and tries to spring people from these facilities is called Make It Stop. These vigilantes have all struggled with substance abuse themselves and are battling uh, to maintain sobriety, not always successfully. So that's one of the subplots of the book, and one of the parts of it, like a source of tension, sometimes a source of dark comedy, is that these people are, trying to save people from facilities that, at least nominally, they could use, treatment themselves.
Well, I'm kind of fascinated with the idea of, how much of our society functions just because we all agree to let it function that way. For example, the border with Mexico is a great example. I mean, the border is imaginary. I mean, there's no laser wall that stops people from crossing. It's this whole Byzantine network of laws and policies that are always in flux, that regulate the flow of people between two nations that are next door neighbors. Where I live in San Diego, every time I turn into um, the condo where I live, I can see the lights of Tijuana, and I'm always thinking about, like, I mean, what's really stopping that border to cease to exist in our imagination? And when I was in the military, that idea of, like the rules and everything was pretty ironclad. And sometimes it seemed more powerful than like actual laws and real police force and stuff like that. And I think it all stems from, like the English Navy and how difficult it was to run a ship with a bunch of fucked up people, and you had to have like really strong rules and really strong punishments. And that works until it doesn't. And so that works until it doesn't idea is something I'm really fascinated with. And Make It Stop is one of those things. They all agree that they're an underground organization. They move around, they have secret headquarters. But as you mentioned, they all have issues. So
Yeah.
I had some fun with that. And it also, like, what is the engine of story but conflict? So put a bunch of drunks in a room together, whether they're drinking or not, and you're going to end up with conflict.
Well, and there's like, yeah, and there's romantic conflict as well. Like there are a lot of genre tropes that you are operating in this narrative. It's a lot of fun to read. And there's something, I don't know if I'm going to use the right adjective, like pulpy, like almost comic book like. I'm thinking of Applewhite in particular, this kind of
Mm-hmm.
brute villain who is the enforcer for Derek Hansen, the CEO of Health Net Secure. And he's
Mm-hmm.
just this great, menacing character that I could easily see on the screen, and I'm wondering about that part of it for you. Like, how do you conceive? I guess that you'd call this a dystopian thriller. Like that was the objective when you set out was to write a thriller.
No, not at all. I mean, I thought that I thought I had a really good idea with this high concept premise of, a world where if you don't pay your hospital bills, you don't get to leave. And I thought I was writing, when I started out, I wanted to write something, serious, a serious novel. Like I wanted to write literature. I thought I wanted something to be very high minded and unclassifiable. And well, you can kind of already tell that, like, that was almost a plan to fail. And I mean, it took me a long, long time to finish this book, Brad, because I had all my intentions were really not working out, and I really had to kind of sink into the characters and listen to what they wanted to be, but also come to grips with, what what am I capable of? What can I do here? What can I execute and have it be a compelling story? So I leaned into, the crime novel tropes and the comic book stuff, and the crappy TV that is just so addictive. And it's like, hey, if that's the book that I can write, then that's what I'm going to do.
Well, but it makes me think of the fact or the idea and how it is often true that works of art tend to start out as one thing and then eventually become themselves, which is often very different from the thing they started out as. You launch into a book length project and it is inevitably going to mutate as you go, and you're going to be in a process of discovery. And it's got to be interesting to you to have started out with such a different intention than what you wound up with. And yet, I feel like this book is fully realized. I think with the high concept idea that you started with, the choices that you made make tons of sense. Like, of course,
Mhm.
it would be this way, and it also makes it fun to read. Like, it
Well, what
could easily a book about like a dystopian healthcare insurance system could easily become a huge drag.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I wrote a draft of that book, that drag, and I mean, like a lot of the people who have been on the show before, I have plenty of books that didn't make it, right? I finished them and we're like, okay, like I would rather, cut off an arm than go back and revise that mess. So if I feel that way, then, away you go into the proverbial drawer. And there's no shame in abandoning a novel. Sometimes it's just kind of fun to do something and figure out that it wasn't that fun after all. So, but there was just something about both the idea and also Melanie, in that, I had this character and put her in just these incredibly vulnerable situations, and I felt like I had to honor that in some way. I had to, stick with it and not give up on the project.
Where did she come from, Melanie?
Well, I think the last time I was on this show, we were talking about Forest of Fortune, a novel, and one of those characters is a little autobiographical. I may have been reluctant to admit that before. I'd have to go back and see if I copped to it at all, but it has a character who's dealing with alcoholism, who works, as a copywriter at a tribal casino, and all those things were true about me. And I knew that if I was going to go back into the world of addiction, that I didn't want to just have a character where I just funneled my own experiences and my own point of view. And we both know that the healthcare experience is very different for women than it is for men. So I kind of knew that my protagonist needed to be a woman who, was going to have, be put in this intentionally putting herself in this very dangerous position of breaking into a hospital, and then also being extremely vulnerable when she gets there. So that's kind of why I settled on Melanie, as opposed to, having someone who was like myself again. I just did not want to do that.
Well, and then there's another element to the novel which is so central and so key, and which braids into the narrative and into the dystopia that you're drawing here. It braids into the narrative of the pharmaceutical industry. And you've created this drug called Bliss, which I believe is, supposed to be, I think it's advertised as something that's like, used for sex therapy, or it helps people awaken to their libidos or whatever, but it actually has much darker qualities that are leveraged by Health Net Secure. Do I have that right?
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, one of the things about being in recovery and being very comfortable in my recovery, um, I mean, there aren't too many days where I'm white knuckling it through the day, and maybe that's tomorrow, maybe that's coming, but today is a great day. And when I read about an imaginary drug in a book, I'm always like, ooh, I wonder what that's like. And I don't have to feel guilty because it's not fucking real. It's make believe. And so I've always wanted to, make up a drug. And what's a little strange is that I don't know how much I knew about fentanyl. I started this 10 years ago, but in a way, the drug I made is a little tame compared to how widespread fentanyl is. And the only difference is that this drug is intentionally made with chemicals that, if you take it orally, you'll get the full effect. But if you start shooting this stuff up, the effect is even more intense, but it comes with a real physical cost. So of course people are going to be shooting it up, and that gets to be a problem.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I noted this. It's a little bit of a dark observation, but the scenes that take place in bars that have to do with alcohol, the scenes that take place in punk clubs or in the punk club, very well drawn. I was like, well, Jim has been around. He knows these places because, the descriptions of like the dark bar, like the beachside bar. I forget exactly what language you use, but it's like, man, I was there. You could feel the coldness of the glass and the whole thing. So in a kind of dark way, that must have been fun for you. Like you say, it's all in the imagination.
Oh yeah, I did my homework. It was nice to be able to put that research to some kind of legitimate purpose, right?
Yeah. Well, and speaking of research, like another thing that I noted about this book is that the action sequences, of which there are several, are very well done. And those are difficult in my experience. I don't know if this is the case for you, but I feel like trying to write like a really heavy action sequence in fiction, there's a lot of opportunities to lose the reader in space. You got to really keep people oriented. And I kept thinking to myself, wow, he's got a military background. There's a lot of like infiltration and extraction sequences. That's the nature of what this vigilante group does. You had to be capitalizing on your military background a little bit, no?
Absolutely not. I think that's hilarious because I was a deck seaman, so I worked in a paint locker. I pushed paintbrushes around. I pushed mops around. I mean, I was qualified to, shoot the 50 caliber machine gun or whatever. But no, my day-to-day life was basically paint and preservation, a janitor for the industrial military complex. So I think that's very funny. Yeah, they even have a nickname for what we are. We're deck apes. So
Glamorous.
any deck apes listening would find that characterization very funny. But I met a guy who was a thriller writer, and he told me that he likes to think when he like he's written like 30 books or 20, I don't know how many, but that he likes to think of organizing his books around it like as a series of raids. And that made a lot of sense to me, especially since I have this group, kind of trying to infiltrate these hospitals and get people out. So, and also you see that all the time in television too, right? It's like five people in a room. They're looking something at a screen. It's like, okay, here's our mission. And then there's very unrealistic that the same five people are then going to all pile into a van and then actually carry it out. But that's the case. And so yeah, I learned it all from TV and airport thrillers.
Oh, interesting. Was it challenging? Were those sequences particularly challenging, or no?
I mean, yeah, there's always a tendency to go too fast. I think you got to slow it down a little bit, but not so much that it becomes, opposite to what you're trying to accomplish, but not so fast that you're like, well, where are we and what's happening? And like when I read those thrillers, when I kind of get lost in the world and I don't know where I am, then that's or the cheats are becoming too obvious. Like when there's all these explosions going off and people are yet communicating via tiny little microphones in their ears, it just seems like, okay, this is a little silly. So I didn't ever want it to get silly.
Right. Right. And you've got a lot of technology. I mean, we talked about the drug that you invented, but there's also like, stuff that's fairly easy to imagine happening in the not too distant future, where people are talking to each other via holograms. I think they're called hollows in the novel, and they have tabs, which are like communication devices. I'm trying to think of if there's anything else, but these are the things that you must have. I don't know. It's not too difficult to conjure that stuff, right? These are not giant leaps. It feels like this is the direction that we're heading.
Brad, I'm a little insulted because 10 years ago, these were massive leaps forward in thinking. Kidding. But yeah, if you're going to write a near future novel, you should try not to take 10 years to do it, because the present will keep eclipsing your imagination in really frustrating ways. So yeah,
if you have good intuition, and good instincts, I mean, that's part of what good speculative fiction or speculative thrillers do, is that they feel either predictive or close to being predictive. And that has, I think, to do with, I was just talking to Emily St. John Mandel on this show about this, about having a good antenna. That's what we were talking about, is like, some writers have really good antennae. And I think, you're demonstrating this with this book, because.
Well, I'm a big lover of the counterfactual, the what if. I think those are some of the most fun premises to explore, where you just take one thing about your life or one thing about society, and you're like, well, what if this happened instead of that? And that can be quite a bit of fun.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about the 10-year process that you went through. I mean, we touched on it already a little bit, but I'm interested to know about the transition from considering this as a serious work of literary fiction and having that be your intention at the outset, and then I guess slowly realizing or suddenly realizing that the book was more of a speculative thriller and had certain genre tropes that were needed to fill it out and make it really sing. At what point in a decade-long process did it start to occur to you that you were on the wrong path? Like, how many like bad drafts were there? At what point did you make the pivot?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little hard to say. Like part of it is that I like to think that I would have figured it out a lot faster if I was not also, working on some other nonfiction projects. Like I've written some books with some punk rockers. Like I wrote a book with Keith Morris. I think that had already happened the last time we talked. But after that, I wrote a book with Bad Religion, and then I wrote a narrative history of SST Records. And had some other things that went on. So I had those projects as well that I was kind of going back and forth between. And I like to think that, I learned, for each project, I learned, I became a better writer, and I learned something about how to approach a problem that I did not know how to solve, or I may not have even recognized in an earlier draft. Um, I will say that probably the moment where I realized that how to fix it was I adapted part of the memoir that I wrote with Keith Morris. Keith Morris is the founding vocalist for Black Flag and the Circle Jerks, and it was for a project where we were just going to explore Keith's childhood in Hermosa Beach in the 70s. That was going to be the feature for an indie film. Basically, it ends where Black Flag begins, right? So it's about all that. And I was really amazed how we got a whole feature out of about like 70 pages of Keith's memoir. And there were more stories that he told me and more things that we fleshed out. But when we got done with that, I just could not wait to adapt my novel into a screenplay as well. But I realized that like
Wait,
the
this novel or
novel,
a different one?
hmm?
This novel you wanted to adapt or a different one?
Yeah, meant to make it stop because I feel like I would figure out what was wrong with it.
Ah.
And I did because you have a scene and I'm like, well shit, this guy is just sitting in a room having thoughts. He's just smoking a cigarette. There's nothing happening. When you do that, adaptation process, like there's nowhere to hide. My friend Joshua Moore always says that about like when you adapt something, like there's just nowhere to hide. I mean, it's either a scene or it's not. And I had a lot of scenes that weren't. And so that really got me thinking about like, changing up the different locations, having more dynamic things happen. And I think maybe that's when it really started to take a genre turn. And then I went into the pandemic and I had, the novel was fairly long, and it was much more than I basically had a television show's worth, entire season's worth of scripts. So then I began to adapt it back into a novel, which is a great way to learn, what's wrong with your book. But man, did it take a fucking long time to do that.
Yeah, but that makes so much sense. And it's an interesting because I was the next question I was going to ask you before we got onto this track was whether or not you outlined, because this is a novel that is concerned with plot, that does well with plot. It's one of those books, which is usually the case with a well plotted novel, where as I was reading it, I was kind of from my writerly perspective thinking like, how's he going to land this plane?
Mm-hmm.
Because I couldn't see the ending coming. And usually I have a good nose for that sort of thing. So that's to your credit. But in the absence of doing an outline, I can't think of a better way to put a novel together like this, or to give yourself a slow, painful crash course in plotting than to take the prose that you've written and to try to adapt it into what it sounds like is either a limited series or season one of a television series, and like you say, nowhere to hide. It'll show you where the slow parts are, if nothing else.
Yep. So, it really took a long time. And so it's not something I necessarily recommend, um, especially if you like, have a family or something. But It just so happened that it was during the pandemic, and I was working on a nonfiction book, pretty intensely. And I had another friend, my friend JD O'Brien, who I was just touring around Arizona with. He had written a screenplay and he wanted to adapt it into a novel. So we just traded chapters. We just work on it just a little bit each night, turning our projects written or scripts back into a novel. And it was just kind of amazing that the books that we actually it worked, and the books were better, and they found a publisher and they came out around the same time. It was just kind of astonishing, that it all worked out that way, because it seems like something that shouldn't or wouldn't happen.
Is it a process that you could see yourself repeating, at least in some form? Like, was it useful enough that you think it might be something that becomes central to your work, or do you think it's project specific?
I think it's project specific. I really don't want to jinx myself, Brad, but I recently wrote a first draft of a novel in about 7 months, and I think it's pretty much all there. It needs a lot of work, but I don't think it has anywhere near the kind of problems that I was encountering with the previous book. So every project is different, has its own challenges, and different stories have different shortcomings and different strengths. But um, for now, I'm kind of operating under the illusion that I've turned a corner, and won't need to do such an extensive rewrite to figure out how to pull the story together.
Is there anything that you feel like carried over from Make It Stop to the novel that you just drafted in 7 months? Like, were there plot issues that maybe you solved more quickly than you otherwise would have because of the lessons that you learned from the long, grueling process that you went through?
Well, that's a great question. I haven't really reflected too much on it, other than you know, I hmm, I think one of the things is that whole notion of the dream of the novel, in that you know you can take as long as it takes to write a novel. But I think for most people, at least for me, it was periods where I was very intensely engaged with it, and periods where I was not. It's not like I was, you know, typing away at a novel for 10 years in a dark basement somewhere. I think it was, being in and out of it, and things happening, and being, when you're engaged with it, that's when the things happen. And when you're not, well, it just sits there, right? So I think that knowing, like, sustaining that dream, and then when I had a like kind of a break right in the middle of that period, like being okay with that, and knowing, like, okay, well, it's just good, this is just the way it's going to have to be right now. Let's clear the deck so I can get back to it as quickly as possible. And because I'm in my 50s now, so I don't have very many 10-year novels left in me, Brad. So
Right. Got to pick your projects carefully. And sometimes, as difficult as it can be for an author to endure a long gestation process or to be juggling multiple projects or dealing with whatever, life has in store, sometimes I find that the longer process and the lulls that you might go through can ultimately be of benefit to the project and can bring things to it that wouldn't have been there otherwise.
yeah, and I think if whatever it is, I think you just have to learn to be okay with it, because I know in my 20s I filled my head with all these toxic ideas of Jack Kerouac wrote this in 15 minutes on speed, or whatever it is. And, you know,
It's a nice,
James
nice help.
Joyce had finished Dubliners by the time he was 25. I mean, all those stupid things that you compare yourself to, and all it does is just set you back further, because you're preoccupied with the wrong thing.
And what about sobriety as it relates to creativity? I'm always interested in this when I speak with writers who have gone through a recovery process. Like, we both know that this profession has a lot of strong ties to substance abuse. Some of it gets glorified. You talk about Kerouac or you talk about
Mhm.
Hemingway. I think men in particular. There's like a masculine kind of macho thing that happened in the 20th century in particular, where I think it can become a problem. when you internalize that, right? I mean, it's like you almost feel like you have to be a boozer in order to be a writer, at least at an earlier stage of life. And I'm just curious to know about having the aspiration to write, as you said, filling your head with toxic ideas in your 20s, probably filling your head with other toxic things, and then getting to a place where you ultimately put all that stuff down. Like I guess maybe a good place to start is like, when did you get sober? And then if you could just talk a little bit about how it not only like impacted your life, but how it in particular impacted your creative life.
Sure. I love this question. I got sober in 2009, so about, I think I just celebrated 14 years in February. And, the benefits were right away. I was, mainly an alcoholic, along with other things that would kind of help that going. But when I got sober, I was newly married, a fairly new parent. I had a job, and I lost a close friend to addiction, and I believe we talked about this actually the last time I was on. And that was a wake up call, and so it was kind of a high bottom because I didn't lose all the things that it usually takes to kind of snap people out of their disease. But some very close to me lost everything, and thankfully that was enough. And the benefits to my creative life were immense because, one, it freed me from just all these lies that I was dragging around, trying to project this image of myself as a sane and sober person when I was just off the rails and riddled with secrets and just drinking every chance that I got. And of course, people close to me knew that, but I had to lie and pretend like none of it was happening. And just to be relieved, put all that aside, was just an immense relief. And now I just tell on myself all the time, like there's no, I got no shame about the things I used to do, and it feels great. But one of the best things is that I learned early on that, for me and for many alcoholics, is that resentment is a one way ticket to a relapse. I mean, that's kind of what they teach you in the rooms, is that you got to live a resentment free life. You got to have gratitude for where you are. And I never realized how much resentment is tied in with the arts, whether you're a musician or a visual artist or a writer. But there's all this resentment about things that aren't happening in your career, things that you're not getting, awards, other people's success. There's a lot of resentment about all of those things. And that I didn't really, wasn't even really aware of was happening. And then once I just kind of cleared the decks of that resentment, I was able to just really be a happier person, but happy for all the success that other people were enjoying, and that I wasn't turned inside out by these things that I felt like, you know and I wasn't quite there yet because I didn't have much of a career before I got sober, but I could see it. I could see myself turning into this bitter older person who was just riddled with resentment and about all the things that should have happened. That was who I was going to be. That was absolutely the course that I was on. And now it's pretty great where I can you know just be concerned, with my own work and not worry about outcomes, not worry about anything that happens. And when those great things happen to other people that I know or are in the same circle, I can be genuinely happy for those people. So yeah,
So
that's been a huge gift.
I bet. And I think it's worth like drilling down a little bit more into like clearing the decks of resentment. Like it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to do that. It's one thing to know that it's worth doing and another thing to be able to do it. Like you get sober, you recognize that that resentment is causing you problems and isn't really serving you creatively or otherwise. And then what? You just let go of it? That's it? I mean, like how does it actually happen in practice?
Well, when I got sober, I was working at a casino, and it was during the recession. It was all this upheaval and constant shifting around, and people getting fired and let go and quitting, and you know, um, it's a very strange place to work to begin with. But it had Um, there's something interesting about the casino industry, just as an aside, that there's kind of a meritocracy that doesn't exist in other places, so that you can be a server in a restaurant and 10 years later be in upper management. It is possible to happen in that environment. Um, but after one of these readjustments, there was like someone who I didn't get along with, and it didn't get along with me, who was now my direct supervisor. And I just had to be like, I got to do something about this. I can't, you know, I just I can't have this relationship where I'm just completely resentful of everything she says or everything I say to her, and it was just going to be a major problem unless I really worked at this relationship. And so I found something that we had in common, which was restaurants, because we lived in a kind of similar area, and we both like to go to some of these places. And so every Monday, I just made a point to talk about like where I went out to eat that weekend. And all of a sudden, we had like a real relationship, and all that other stuff, which was mainly in my head anyway, just started to fade away. So that's just kind of an example of like a practical way of dealing with it.
Well, that's what I mean. What you're just talking, what you just said about how most of it is in your head. I think that's the way these things ultimately work. Is it's not like a sudden total banishment of every resentful feeling or thought in your head, but it is the establishment of mistrust in their validity and certainly in their permanence. Like once you realize that this stuff is there and you sort of see it for what it is, and you realize how ephemeral it is and how often it's cooked up, it's not really rooted in all that much reality,
Right.
then you don't trust it as much anymore. And when you
Yeah.
don't trust it as much anymore, it has less control over you.
Yeah. And that's kind of like in my relationship with my wife, where we're kind of at now, where it used to take me a long time to realize just how absurd I am or how I was being. Um, Now with some conditioning and training, no, I'm kidding. Now I kind of am much faster to see, you know, the bullshit that's at the root of so many arguments and disagreements, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, I feel like as like a marriage progresses, if it's progressing decently well enough, like the time gaps get shorter between being a fool and recognizing it.
Yeah,
You apologize more quickly, or you just stop being a jerk more quickly. That's been the case for me. You get a little bit better. It's always imperfect, but you get hopefully a little bit better, as you go. And eventually those
yeah.
little
Isn't
bits
that the
add
way?
up.
I think if all the men would just realize what a jerk they are, the world would be a better place.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, and it's like, I don't know. I go through these, like we're going through a period right now in my household. It's just busy. And somebody was saying that Mercury is in retrograde. It's about to go out of retrograde. I don't believe in all that stuff, or I don't know enough about it to know, but like I'm willing to blame that. I'm always happy to blame something, but shit has just been crazy and super hectic. It's like the end of the year. There's travel we've got to do. It's like all this stuff is just coming at me. And when I get into those situations, I don't always handle it well. Like I can just get overloaded. And I caught myself last night. I had to go to some like school event for my daughter, and I was just like, "Don't be an asshole. Don't be an asshole." Just having like a quiet, like giving myself a speech, like internally, and I reined it in decently well enough. I considered it a victory. Is the point? I didn't
Yeah,
fully
well, hey,
demonstrate.
being a parent is hard, and my daughter is in college, and I miss her like crazy. And it's the time you have is fleeting, and I know everybody says that, and it goes by so fast, but it really
It really
does.
does. It really does. Yeah. No, I'm feeling that right now. Like we're heading into junior high, and it feels like I think when you're going through parenthood, there's all these like moments where you're like, already? Like, holy,
Mhm.
like, where did it go? Like, I just brought her home from the hospital, and I mean, it sounds cliche, but that really is how it goes. And maybe that's just life, and I feel like it's life increasingly as you get older. It feels like it speeds up as you get older, which is sort of cruel.
Yeah, like once you start to get a handle on things, you're like, "Oh, wait, it's what year is it? How old am I?" You know,
Yeah.
"What are these tubes in my arm?" No.
Right, right. So let's talk about I want to talk about punk rock
Okay,
before I leave you. You mentioned earlier that you've written a lot of books on this subject and have collaborated with musicians. Your book, Corporate Rock Still Sucks, or Corporate Rock Sucks,
that's right.
is uh, is along these lines. This music obviously has a lot of import to you personally, and I feel like Make It Stop is infused with a kind of punk rock spirit. There is, as we talked about, the scene that takes place in a punk club. There's a band called the Führers, I believe. Um, Not to be confused with like the German word Führer, but like Furor, right?
Yeah, the righteous anger, not the leader of the Third Reich.
Right, right, exactly. So you are a huge punk fan. You have to be, right?
I am, yes.
Like, I'm curious to know, like, why, like, how that music grabbed a hold of you. I'm also curious to know how it might inform the work that you do in a literary sense.
Sure, well, the Ramones started it off. You know, I saw the Ramones when I was, like, 15 years old in DC. My mom actually took me and my brother, and that was pretty amazing, and, it wasn't one of those things where, like, "Ah, I found my tribe," like you hear with a lot of people, because my parents were really strict, and I wasn't really allowed to do those kinds of things, and I was the oldest of 4, and we went to Catholic school, and, you know, I was a pretty good rule follower until I joined the military and realized, like, "Fuck this," and that was where, like, a really good, education in my you know, that's when I, like, met, you know, punk rockers and metalheads from Arizona and skinheads from Louisiana and just all this, like, you know, music I had never been exposed to, from all corners of the country, and, and it wasn't until I got hooked up with, people that wrote for zines that I realized, like, that could be my entry point because 'cause I'm not a musician, you know, was just kind of a fan. And these punk rock fanzines were just gave me access to the music that I love, and it just meant if you just write a little bit, you know, do some reviews, and that led to doing interviews, which was always fun, to led to having a column, and, I wrote for Flipside for many years, and then when that went under, for Razorcake, which I still do to this day. So zines, it was all about zines being it, and that when you write for a punk rock zine like Razorcake, I mean, you're always finding out about really incredible stuff.
So what is it about the music that you respond to so much?
I like the DIY aspect of it. I like the fact that it's not for most people. I like that it is. I mean, like punk is cool in a way. Like it's kind of cool to be someone my age and be like a gatekeeper and have like a you know circle jerks poster on your wall or something like that. But I'm just always like immensely impressed with the DIY spirit and that whole idea of like young kids just doing something to do it and doing it together and making something real and then going out in the world and sharing it. I just find that fascinating. Um,
Did you ever get down into the pit? Like, I mean, there's a scene you describe so vividly at that punk club where the Führers are playing in your novel, and it can get kind of rough down there. Like, were you in those scenes, like, as a younger man?
Yeah, but I was, you know, like, yes and no. Like, you know, I've never been all that terribly interested in, you know, that whole weird display of male dominance slash, um, yeah, I really don't know. It's kind of that whole thing is strange to me. But like, I went to see, you know, I'm old enough to have seen Fugazi, for example, at the Palladium, which was an enormous pit. It seemed to take an hour to go all the way around it, and it was like each circle around it was like a novel, along with a few lectures from Ian MacKaye. Um, so, so yeah, I'm not just dismissing it with one thing, but it's just really fascinating in that like these books have taken me places I never thought I'd go. I've like following Bad Religion around and getting the whole punk stadium festival experience has been really eye opening. But I still prefer like the dingy, dirty little punk rock club. And And to be honest, Brad, those were places that I kind of had to stop going to when I got sober. And it took me a while to be able to go back and like not feel like, doing some blow in the bathroom would make this a lot better.
Right. Well, I mean, that's like got to be one of the most difficult like hurdles or challenges to deal with in sobriety is like being a social person and finding yourself in situations where you have proximity to places like that. Like I have friends that are sober and have been sober a long time, and like you say, uh, I forget how you put it earlier, but it's not like a super dangerous situation. Like they're stable in their sobriety, at least on that day, so they can do it. They can go out to a bar with friends and have a soda water with a lime in it and hang out. But that's got to be something that you work towards, I would imagine.
Well, it's kind of interesting. Being a punk of a certain age means, unfortunately, that a lot of your friends are dead. That's just the way it is. But it also means that a lot of your friends are sober. And maybe a larger percentage than any of the other circles that I'm involved with. I know more sober punks than sober writers, for example, although there are quite a few out there. So that part is good.
Well, but I feel like I mean, it almost feels like it's got to be one or the other at a certain age. Like, how can you continue to? I marvel at anybody who can still abuse substances like past the age of 45. Like, that was the pivot for me. I mean, my pivot actually happened much earlier. Like, I just couldn't deal with the hangovers. Like, it just wasn't practical for me. But I think as you age, it just gets harder and harder to absorb the physical toll, especially if you're really in deep. And I don't know. I guess some people just have really strong constitutions or they're just used to it or something. But I have a few friends that are still living pretty rough at almost the age of 50. And it's like, I don't know where that ends. Probably nowhere
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. I think it takes I'm always impressed when I meet people who got sober at a very young age, but there's a thing where you go from like, oh my God, never having a drink again to thank God I never have to experience another hangover.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just talked with Claire Dieterer on this show. She is a
Mhm.
sober writer. And I was asking her about it, and she described the process of sobriety, and I'm going to botch this, but she said something along the lines of it was like being on a very slow moving river away from self hatred, like day after day. And
That's
I
great.
think, yeah, but I mean, I think it has very much to do with the state that you're in when you're hungover. At least that's how I imagine it, and
Mhm.
have experienced it. I mean, even as a person who is not struggling with addiction, everybody who has gone out on a bender has woken up at some point and been like, what the hell did I say last night? Or like,
Mhm.
what did I do? And you sort of feel shame. And that
Yep.
has to be a huge emotional toll for somebody who's really struggling.
Yep. Yep.
So kudos for not having to deal with that, you know?
Thank you,
So
Brad. Yeah, I definitely want to check out Claire's book. I've been hearing great things about it.
yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one. And I know that you are on tour and you have to get to the next stop. You're on like this big tour. Can you talk about it? Like, I mean, I guess this is going to go up a little bit after the fact, but how long are you on tour for, first of all?
I'm doing 8 events in the Midwest, and they're just kind of, I'm going to be in bookstores. I was in a bike shop in Madison last night. I'm going to go to St. Paul and then Chicago, and I'm going to be in record stores. So it's just kind of a stone soup kind of a tour. I'm going to be in a bar actually in one place. It's also a performance space. So, I'm going to hit the road with Aaron Birch for the second half of this leg, and then June I'll do some more stuff. But I got to admit that I did schedule two of these events around a punk rock show, one in St. Paul and one in Chicago, going to see Off, Keith Morris's band, and who's a great human being and a great inspiration for doing. You're never too old to do what you love.
There you go. And you talked earlier about this. I always ask people at the end what they're working on. You say you have a novel in the works that you've drafted.
Yep, yep.
Any hints as to what it's about?
It's about four English instructors who go on a crime spree in northern Arizona in 1993.
Okay. You've got my attention. Jim, it's great to catch up with you and to see you. And I want to congratulate you on Make It Stop.
Thank you.
Really great book and a lot of fun to read. And I hope it doesn't come true. If it does,
Yeah.
if it does, we know who to blame. You know, we'll all come find you. But I wish you
We
well.
have to use this podcast as a way to recruit people into the other people vigilante movement.
That's right. This is day one of that process. But congratulations on all of it. Best of luck on whatever is next and on the rest of the tour.
Thank you, Brad.